Old man, you really think you can stand against us? Travis, Hole snarled. Stepping closer, his men fanning out behind him like wolves closing on wounded prey. Daniel Whitmore didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply set down his wrench, looked the young thug dead in the eyes, and said 4 words that would change everything. You have no idea. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Red Hollow, Montana was the kind of town where nothing ever happened, and that was exactly how the people who lived there liked it. Mornings came slow. The diner on Main Street opened at 6, and by 6:15, the same 6 regulars were already sitting in the same 6 seats, drinking the same burnt coffee and talking about the same things they'd talked about the day before. The mountains stood quiet in the distance, capped white, even in late spring, watching over the valley like old sentries who had seen everything and were tired of being impressed by any of it. And at the edge of town where the highway curved past a rusted grain silo, in a stand of lodgepole pines, sat a small repair shop with a hand-painted sign that read, Whitmore Auto and Diesel. Everybody in Red Hollow knew Dan Whitmore. He was 68 years old, built like a man who had worked with his hands his whole life, with forearms that still carried the kind of strength that comes from decades of labor rather than gyms. His hair had gone fully silver, cropped close and neat. His hands were rough scarred in places, stained permanently at the knuckles, with engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. He fixed trucks. He fixed tractors. He fixed the old Ford that belonged to the Hendersons and the diesel engine in Miller's grocery delivery van, and he never once in 11 years of running that shop charged anyone more than what was fair. Sometimes he charged them nothing at all. Dan, you can't keep doing that, Sarah Miller told him one morning, leaning against the frame of his open garage door with 2 coffees in her hands, one for herself and one she'd brought for him without being asked. She was 29, dark-haired, with tired eyes that still managed to hold warmth in them, a single mother raising a 6-year-old daughter on a waitress's wages. You fixed the Hendersons' brakes for free last week. That's the 3rd free job this month. They're struggling, Dan said, simply not looking up from the engine he was working on. Everybody's struggling. You're struggling too. I'm fine. Sarah studied him for a long moment. There was something about Dan Whitmore that she had never quite been able to name. He was gentle, genuinely, quietly gentle, the kind of man who remembered your birthday and your daughter's favorite candy and always asked how you were doing like he actually wanted to know the answer. But there was something underneath that gentleness, something still, something that watched. She'd noticed it the first week she met him 3 years ago when a car backfired on Main Street and every single person on the sidewalk had jumped except Dan. Dan had simply turned his head and toward the sound, assessed it in half a second, and gone back to what he was doing before anyone else had even finished flinching. She'd asked him about it once. He just smiled and said, old habits. He never elaborated. And Sarah, respecting him too much to push, never asked again. That morning, nothing about the day felt different. The sky was clear. The birds were loud in the pines behind the shop. Dan had 2 vehicles scheduled an oil change for the Peterson sedan and a transmission problem on Old Man Garrity's pickup truck, and he was humming quietly to himself, an old tune from a life he rarely spoke about, when the sound of engines came rolling down the highway. Not one engine, several. Dan's humming stopped. He set down the wrench in his hand slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down something when he wants both hands free, and he turned toward the sound. 4 trucks came around the bend, engines gunning louder than necessary tires, kicking up gravel dust as they swung into the gravel lot in front of his shop with no regard for the cones marking his customer parking. They parked at hard angles, blocking the entrance, blocking the exit, the kind of parking that wasn't about convenience. It was a message. 5 men climbed out. At the front of them walked a man in his early 30s, lean and sharp-jawed, wearing a leather jacket despite the warm weather, gold chains catching the morning sun, a smirk already fixed on his face like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror. This was Travis Cole. Dan didn't know his name yet, but he would. "You Whitmore," Travis called out, stopping about 15 feet away, his men spreading into a loose half circle behind him, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, boxing the old man in without seeming to try. "That's the name on the sign," Dan said evenly. Travis smiled wider. "Good, then we're in the right place. Help you with something?" Dan asked. He hadn't moved from beside his workbench. His voice carried no fear, no aggression, just the flat, patient tone of a man asking a customer what kind of oil their car needed. Yeah, Travis said, strolling closer, boots crunching over gravel, taking his time, clearly enjoying the walk. You can help me. See, me and my associates, we're starting a little business venture here in Red Hollow. Protection services, every shop, every store, every restaurant on this strip, they're going to pay us a little something every month. Keeps things running smooth. Keeps accidents from happening. Accidents, Dan repeated. Fires, break-ins, vandalism. Bad things happen to places that don't have friends looking out for them. Travis spread his hands like the whole thing was obvious, reasonable, a simple transaction between businessmen. You want friends, old man? Dan looked at him for a long moment, not with fear, not even really with anger. He looked at Travis Cole the way a man looks at weather he's already lived through 100 times before something to be assessed, understood, and dealt with accordingly. I've got friends, Dan said quietly. Good ones. I don't need to buy new ones. One of the men behind Travis, a heavy-set guy with a shaved head and a neck tattoo crawling up toward his jaw, laughed low and ugly. This old man's got jokes. Travis's smile thinned just slightly, the first crack in the performance. See, that's not really the answer I was looking for. It's the only one I've got, Dan said. Travis took another step closer, close enough now that Dan could smell the cologne he'd clearly over-applied that morning, the kind of scent men wear when they want to seem more important than they are. Let me explain something to you since you're old and maybe a little slow. This isn't a negotiation. Every business on this strip is going to pay $500 a month starting today. You're no different. I am actually, Dan said. Different, I mean. Yeah, how's that? Dan finally set down the rag in his hand, wiped his palms slowly against his jeans, and looked directly into Travis Cole's eyes with a stillness that made even the heavy-set man behind him shift uncomfortably on his feet. Because you just walked into my shop in front of my customers' cars and threatened to burn it down, Dan said. And you did it thinking I was just some old man who fixes engines. You didn't do your homework, son. For a moment, something flickered across Travis's face, not quite fear, but the beginning cousin of it, a flicker of uncertainty he quickly buried under bravado. He laughed, forcing it, glancing back at his men like he needed them to laugh along with him, and they did a beat too late, a beat too loud. Homework, Travis repeated, shaking his head. You hear this guy, homework? He stepped even closer, close enough that he was nearly chest to chest with Dan trying to use his height. He had a good 4 inches on the older man to loom over him. Let me tell you what I know, old man. I know you run a shop that barely breaks even. I know you live alone in that little house up on Cedar Ridge. I know you don't got no family, no backup, nobody coming to save you if things go bad here. You're an old man, alone, running a small shop. Nobody is coming to save you. The words hung in the air. Dan didn't answer right away. He simply held Travis's gaze unblinking, and something in his posture, a stillness, a readiness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with something buried deep, something coiled and patient, made even the confident young thug take an almost imperceptible half-step back. You should leave, Dan said quietly, before you make a mistake you can't undo. The words weren't loud. They weren't threatening in tone, but something in the way he said them, flat, certain, without a trace of bluff, made the gravel lot go very quiet. Travis recovered fast, forcing another laugh, louder this time, playing to his crew. Mistake, man. Look at this guy, 60-something years old, standing here talking about mistakes like he's got something to back it up. He turned in a slow circle, arms spread, addressing his men like Dan was a punchline. This whole town's been running scared of nothing. An old grease monkey and a couple of scared shopkeepers. This is going to be easier than I thought. He turned back to Dan, jabbing a finger toward his chest, stopping just short of actually touching him. $500 a month. First payment's due Friday. You don't pay, this place burns. You understand me, old man? Dan didn't answer. Travis smirked, satisfied, mistaking silence for surrender. He turned and started walking back toward his truck, his men falling in behind him. Boots crunching, gravel laughter already rising among them like they just won something. But as he reached his truck door, Travis paused, glancing back one more time, unable to resist a final shot. Oh, an old man, he called out, but nice shop. Shame if something happened to it. Dan Whitmore stood exactly where he'd been standing, the entire conversation, arms loose at his sides, face unreadable, and said nothing at all. The trucks peeled out of the gravel lot in a spray of dust and noise engines, roaring unnecessarily loud as they turned back onto the highway and disappeared toward town, leaving Dan alone in the sudden quiet. The birds in the pines behind the shop starting to sing again, like nothing had happened at all. He stood there for a long moment. Then slowly he walked back to his workbench, picked up the wrench he'd set down, and looked at it in his hand like he was seeing it for the first time in years. His hands were steady, but something in his eyes had changed. Odd. Sarah found out about it 20 minutes later, when she stopped by on her lunch break to drop off a sandwich the way she often did, and found Dan sitting on the old metal stool beside his workbench, not working, just sitting, staring at nothing. Dan. She set the sandwich down on the workbench, her waitress instincts immediately picking up on something wrong. "Hey, you okay?" He blinked, coming back to himself, and offered her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Sarah." "You don't look fine." "Just a rough morning." She crossed her arms, unconvinced. Sarah Miller had spent 3 years learning to read the small signals in Dan Whitmore's face, the ones he thought he hid well, and right now every one of them was firing at once. "What happened?" Dan hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. "Some men came by," he said finally. "Wanted money. Protection money, they called it." Sarah's face went pale. "Oh my God, the gang that's been going around Travis Cole's people. You know about them?" "Everyone knows about them, Dan. They hit Pete's hardware store 2 weeks ago, broke his front window, hit the Nguyen's restaurant last week, smashed up their walk-in freezer, cost them thousands. Nobody's talked about it because everyone's too scared." Sarah's hands were trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat against the workbench to steady them. "The sheriff's tried to do something, but he's got, 3 deputies for the whole county. They can't be everywhere." Dan absorbed this in silence. "Dan, you need to pay them," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "I know it's not fair, I know it's extortion, but Pete didn't pay, and look what happened to his window. You have to think about your safety." Dan looked up at her, and for just a moment, just a flicker, something old and heavy moved behind his eyes, something that had nothing to do with the 68-year-old mechanic sitting in front of her. "I'm not paying them, Sarah." "Dan, I'm not paying them," he repeated, quiet but absolutely final. "Not because I can't. Because if I pay them, they'll be back next month asking for more. And the month after that. Men like that don't stop when you give them what they want. They stop when they understand there are consequences to what they're doing." Sarah stared at him, something shifting in her expression, not doubt exactly, but a kind of dawning curiosity mixed with fear. "Consequences? Dan, it's you against a gang of 5, 6 guys, maybe more. What consequences are you talking about?" Dan didn't answer that. He simply picked up his wrench again and turned back to the engine in front of him, the conversation, as far as he was concerned, finished. But Sarah didn't leave. She stood there a moment longer, watching him work, watching the careful, controlled way his hands moved even now, even rattled, and she noticed something she'd never quite let herself fully notice before. The tattoo on his left forearm, faded with age, half hidden under his rolled-up sleeve. She'd seen it 100 times and never really looked at it. Now she looked. It wasn't military. She knew military tattoos. Her uncle had been Army, and Dan had mentioned once briefly that he'd served too. This wasn't that. This was something else. Old ink blurred by decades, but still visible if you look closely enough. A wing design, weathered letters she couldn't quite make out from where she stood. "Dan," she said slowly, "what's that tattoo?" He glanced down at his arm like he'd forgotten it was there, then rolled his sleeve down without a word covering it. "Old story," he said, "for another day." That night, alone in his small house on Cedar Ridge, Dan Whitmore sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, going cold in front of him, and an old cigar box open beside it. The kind of box a man keeps for exactly one purpose, holding the pieces of a life he doesn't talk about anymore. Inside were photographs yellowed at the edges. A dozen men standing in front of motorcycles, younger versions of faces some of them didn't have anymore. A folded patch carefully preserved the leather, still supple despite its age. A set of dog tags from a different chapter of his life, entirely tangled together with a set of worn leather gloves. He picked up one photograph in particular and looked at it for a long time. In it, he stood in the middle of 8 other men, all of them younger, all of them grinning, all of them wearing the same leather vests with the same patch on the back. He remembered that day like it was yesterday, the noise, the laughter, the feeling of belonging to something that would never let him fall. He hadn't spoken to any of them in 11 years. Not because anything had gone wrong between them, because he needed to leave, needed to become someone quiet, someone ordinary. After everything, after the losses, after the funerals, after the weight of it all, had become too heavy to carry inside a life that never stopped moving, he'd needed silence. He'd needed Red Hollow. He'd needed to be simply Dan, the man who fixed engines and nothing more. He told himself it was over. That part of his life closed. Finished. A chapter he'd folded shut and put away in a cigar box in a kitchen drawer. But sitting there now, staring at the faces of men he still thought of as brothers, Dan Whitmore felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in over a decade. Not fear, readiness. He closed the box slowly and sat in the quiet dark of his kitchen for a long, long time. 3 days passed. For those 3 days, Red Hollow held its breath. Travis Cole and his men made their rounds through town like predators marking territory, stopping into Pete's hardware store to check in, lingering outside the Nguyen's restaurant during the dinner rush just long enough to make every customer inside uneasy, cruising slowly past the elementary school in a way that made every parent in town grip their children's hands a little tighter. They didn't come back to Dan's shop. Not yet. But everyone in town knew Friday was coming. Everyone knew what Friday meant. On Wednesday, old man Garrity came by to pick up his pickup truck, and while Dan finished the paperwork, the older farmer leaned against the counter and said low, like he was almost embarrassed to be saying it at all, "Heard those boys came by your place, Dan. You gonna pay 'em?" "No," Dan said simply. Garrity studied him for a moment, weathered face unreadable. "That's either real brave or real foolish, son." "Maybe both," Dan admitted. "They put Pete in the hospital, you know. After the window thing, he tried to talk to them, tried to reason with them. One of them broke 2 of his fingers. Sheriff couldn't do a damn thing. Pete was too scared to press charges. Said if he did, they'd come back and finish the job." Dan's jaw tightened just slightly. "I didn't know that part. Most folks don't talk about it, do? Too scared." Garrity shook his head slowly, taking his keys from Dan's outstretched hand. "You be careful, Dan. I mean it. Whatever backbone you've got, these boys don't play by any rules I've ever seen, and there's more of them than there are of you." Dan watched the old farmer's truck pull away, the words settling heavily in his chest. Pete's fingers, the Nguyen's freezer. The fear in every face he passed on Main Street these days, fear that hadn't existed in Red Hollow a month ago. He thought about it all night. Thursday morning, Sarah came by early before her shift, worry etched deep into her face. "Dan, I need you to think about this seriously," she said, setting a coffee down in front of him with hands that weren't quite steady. "Friday's tomorrow. If you don't pay them—" "I'm not paying them, Sarah." "Then what's your plan? Because from where I'm standing, your plan looks like standing in your shop alone while 5 armed men decide what they're going to do to you and everything you've built here." Her voice cracked slightly, emotion breaking through the practical worry. "I can't lose you too, Dan. Emma already asks about you like your family. If something happens—" "Nothing's going to happen to me," Dan said, and there was something in his voice now. Something calm and certain that made Sarah stop mid-sentence. "How can you possibly know that—" Dan was quiet for a moment, weighing something internally, some decision he'd clearly been circling for days. "Because I made a phone call last night," he said finally. Sarah blinked. "A phone call to who?" "People I haven't spoken to in a long time," Dan said. "People I hoped I'd never need to call again. But people who told me a long time ago that if I ever needed them, really needed them all, I had to do was say the word." "Dan, what are you talking about? What people—" He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Dan Whitmore's eyes carried the full weight of something he'd been hiding for 11 years. "Before I came to Red Hollow," he said slowly, "before I was just the guy who fixes your car, I was somebody else. Somebody with a different kind of family. A brotherhood that doesn't forget, doesn't abandon, and doesn't let anything happen to one of their own, no matter how many years pass, no matter how far away they've gone." Sarah stared at him, the pieces slowly beginning to click together in her mind. The tattoo, the stillness, the way he watched every entrance. the weight he carried that she'd never been able to name. Dan, she said slowly, almost afraid to ask, who are you? He held her gaze for a long moment. Someone I promised myself I would never become again, he said quietly. But someone Red Hollow might need whether I like it or not. Friday arrived heavy with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, the entire town seeming to move slower, speak softer, as if Red Hollow itself understood something was coming. By late afternoon, word had spread quietly the way word does in small towns past between worried shop owners and frightened neighbors that Travis Cole was planning to make an example out of Dan Whitmore's shop tonight. A message to the rest of the town about what happened to people who refused to pay. Sheriff Ray Coleman, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd been running the department for going on 15 years, stopped by the shop around 4 o'clock. His face grim, his hat in his hands. Dan, I want you to consider closing up early today, going somewhere safe for a few days. I've got 3 deputies for this whole county, and I can't guarantee I can get a car out here fast enough if things go bad tonight. I appreciate the concern, Ray, Dan said, continuing to close up his tools for the evening with steady, unhurried hands. But I'm not going anywhere. Dan, these aren't reasonable men. They put a good man in the hospital for less than what you've done telling them, no standing your ground, mouthing off. I've seen what they're capable of. I don't want to see it happen to you. Dan set down the toolbox and looked at the sheriff evenly. Ray, I've been doing some thinking and some calling. I think tonight's going to look different than you're expecting. The sheriff frowned, confused. What's that supposed to mean? Before Dan could answer, the first sound reached them, distant at the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. Engines. Not 4 trucks this time. More. Many more. A low rolling thunder building, steadily from somewhere down the highway, growing louder with every passing second, the kind of sound that made the windows of the shop faintly hum. The sheriff's hand instinctively moved toward his radio. Dan, that doesn't sound like Cole's crew. That sounds like... I know what it sounds like, Dan said quietly. A strange calm settling over his features as he turned toward the sound, toward the highway, toward whatever was coming. The sheriff looked at him, confusion turning slowly into something like alarm. Dan, what did you do? Dan Whitmore stood in the doorway of his shop, watching the road, watching the horizon where dust was beginning to rise beneath a lowering sun, and for the first time in 11 years, something that looked almost like peace crossed his weathered face. I called my brothers home, he said. The sheriff opened his mouth to ask another question, but the words died in his throat as the first motorcycle came around the bend in the highway. Then another, then another. The sound became a wall rolling toward Red Hollow like an approaching storm, and every person on Main Street who heard it stepped outside their shops and homes to see what was coming, drawn by a noise that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Sarah Miller stood frozen on the sidewalk outside the diner, one hand pressed to her mouth, watching dozens of motorcycles crest the hill and pour down into the valley toward Dan's shop. Leather vests catching the last light of the sinking sun, gray-haired riders with weathered, unreadable faces, an unbroken line of machines that seemed to stretch back toward the horizon itself. And on the back of every vest, unmistakable even from a distance, was the same patch, the same name, Hell's Angels. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. Dan Whitmore, quiet, gentle. Dan, who fixed engines and helped struggling neighbors and sat alone on his porch every evening with a cup of coffee, had just summoned an army. And Travis Cole had no idea what was riding into Red Hollow to meet him. The engines didn't stop. They kept coming, wave after wave, until the gravel lot in front of Whitmore Auto and Diesel looked less like a repair shop and more like a staging ground for something enormous. Sheriff Ray Coleman stood frozen beside his cruiser, one hand still hovering near his radio, watching dozens of motorcycles fan out and park in loose practice formation. No chaos to it, no showing off, just discipline. The kind of discipline that came from men who had done this exact thing 1,000 times before. Dan, the sheriff said, voice tight, you want to tell me what in God's name is happening right now? Dan didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the man at the front of the pack, a broad-shouldered rider in his 60s with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that hadn't lost an ounce of their sharpness with age. The man swung off his bike slowly, almost reverently, and pulled off his helmet, revealing a face that Dan Whitmore hadn't seen in 11 years. Marcus, Dan said quietly, The man everyone called Preacher Marcus Doyle, National Road Captain, a man who'd earned his road name decades ago, for the way he used to talk grieving families through funerals. Nobody else had the stomach for, stood still for a long moment, studying Dan the way you study something you were afraid you'd never get to see again. "Danny Whitmore," Preacher said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the name. 11 years, brother, 11 years and not one phone call, not one letter, and then last night you call me at 2 in the morning like it's nothing and say you need us. "I know," Dan said. 11 years. "I know, Marcus." The two men closed the distance between them in 3 steps and embraced hard, the kind of embrace between men who had buried people together, bled together, and carried things neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. Sarah, still standing, frozen on the sidewalk outside the diner, felt her chest tighten, watching quiet, gentle Dan Whitmore disappear for just a moment into something rawer, older, more complicated than the man she thought she knew. "You look older," Preacher said, pulling back, gripping Dan by both shoulders. "You look worse." Preacher barked a laugh, and behind him dozens of riders' men and a handful of women, most in their 50s and 60s, weathered faces, leather-cut vests, bearing the same patch, began dismounting, some grinning, a few walking straight toward Dan, with their hands already extended. "Whitmore, you old ghost," one of them called out, a heavy-set man with forearms like tree trunks and a gray ponytail hanging halfway down his back. "We thought you died somewhere in a ditch." "Tiny," Dan said, shaking the man's hand, then getting pulled into another crushing hug. "Still built like a refrigerator, I see." "Still ugly as one, too," Tiny said, grinning. Sheriff Coleman finally found his voice, stepping forward with the wary posture of a man trying to establish authority he wasn't entirely sure he still had. "All right, folks, I'm going to need somebody to explain to me what exactly is going on here. This is a public roadway, and I've got maybe 40 motorcycles blocking half of Main Street." Preacher turned to him, unbothered, extending a hand. "Marcus Doyle, folks call me Preacher, and you'd be the sheriff, I'm guessing." "Ray Coleman, and I'd appreciate an explanation." "Simple one," Preacher said. "One of ours called and said he was in trouble. We came." "You're one of yours." Coleman glanced at Dan, something shifting behind his eyes. "Dan's a member of your club." Dan, Preacher said, a small, proud smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, "is the reason half the men standing in this lot are still alive to be standing in it." Sarah, who had finally worked up the nerve to approach, stopped a few feet away, staring at Dan like she was seeing him for the very first time. "Dan," she said slowly, "what does that mean?" Dan opened his mouth to answer, but before he could get a word out, the sound of engines returned. Different engines this time, smaller, sharper, coming fast around the bend in the highway with none of the disciplined arrival the bikers had shown. 4 trucks screeched into view and skidded to a stop at the edge of the lot, engines still running, as Travis Cole and his crew stared out through their windshields at a sight none of them had been remotely prepared for. The gravel lot in front of Whitmore Auto and Diesel, the same lot they'd swaggered through 4 days earlier, the same shop they'd promised to burn down if their $500 didn't arrive by tonight, was now filled with somewhere between 40 and 50 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. For a long, frozen moment, nobody moved. Travis Cole sat behind the wheel of his truck, hands still gripping it, his jaw slowly going slack as he did the math in his head, watching leather-vested men with gray hair and hard eyes turn almost in unison toward his vehicles. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. "Boss," the heavy-set man beside him said, voice suddenly much smaller than it had been 4 days ago. "Boss, I think we should go." "Shut up." "Boss, that's the Hells Angels. That's not a couple guys. That's the whole—" "I said shut up." Travis's hands were sweating on the wheel now, and every instinct in his body was screaming at him to throw the truck into reverse and disappear back down the highway. But 4 days of building himself up as the man who owned Red Hollow, 4 days of watching shopkeepers flinch and neighbors avert their eyes, had built something inside him that made backing down in front of everyone unthinkable. He forced the door open and stepped out. His men more hesitantly followed. "Whitmore," Travis called out, trying to inject the same swagger into his voice that had worked so well 4 days earlier, though it came out thinner now, strained at the edges. "Didn't realize you had company." Preacher stepped forward before Dan could say a word, moving with the unhurried calm of a man who had diffused 1,000 situations exactly like this one. "You'd be the young man who's been terrorizing this town," he said. It wasn't a question. Travis's eyes flicked between Preacher and Dan, calculating, recalculating. This ain't your business, old man. See, that's where you're wrong, Preacher said, voice still calm, still even, but with something underneath it now that made the hair on the back of Sheriff Coleman's neck stand up. Because that man standing behind me, the one you threatened, the one you told nobody was coming to save, he's not just some old mechanic to us. He's family. And where I come from, when somebody threatens family, that makes it very much my business. Travis's throat worked visibly as he swallowed. He glanced back at his men, 4 of them now standing stiff and uncertain behind their trucks, badly outnumbered and clearly regretting every decision that had led them to this parking lot tonight. You threatening me? Travis said, forcing bravado back into his voice. No, Preacher said simply. I'm educating you. There's a difference, and you'd be smart to learn it fast. Sheriff, Travis suddenly turned toward Coleman, pointing, latching onto the one authority figure present, like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. Sheriff, these people are trespassing. They're blocking a public road. You gonna do something about that or what? Coleman looked at Travis for a long moment, in something in his face, something that had clearly been building for weeks, months, watching this kid terrorize his town, while his department's hands stayed tied by fear and lack of testimony hardened. Funny, Coleman said slowly. I don't recall you asking me to do anything about the broken window at Pete's hardware store, or the freezer at the Nguyen's place, or Pete's fingers. His voice rose slightly on that last part, and Travis's face flickered. So no, son, I think I'm going to stand right here and watch how this plays out. A murmur went through the bikers, low, satisfied. Travis's confidence, already cracking, began to fracture further. He looked at his men, looked at the sea of leather vests surrounding him, looked at Dana Whitmore standing quiet and unreadable in the middle of it all, and something in his calculations finally clicked into a different configuration entirely. This isn't over, he said, backing toward his truck. You think this changes anything? You think a bunch of old bikers scares me? You're already scared, Preacher said quietly. I can see it in how fast you're walking. Travis's face flushed red. For a moment, it looked like he might actually do something reckless. His hand twitched near his jacket, and beside him, the sheriff's own hand dropped instinctively to his sidearm, the whole lot suddenly holding its breath. Then the heavy-set man beside Travis grabbed his arm. Boss, we're leaving. Now. Travis yanked his arm free, glaring at Dan one final time. This isn't over, old man. It's over the moment you decide it is. Dan said the first words he'd spoken since the confrontation began, quiet, steady, carrying none of the anger that would have been justified. You still have a chance to walk away from this and never come back. I'd take it if I were you. Travis said nothing. He climbed back into his truck, slammed the door hard enough that the sound cracked across the lot like a gunshot, and the 4 trucks reversed out in a spray of gravel engines, screaming as they fled back down the highway toward town. The gravel lot went quiet. Then slowly the townspeople who had gathered along Main Street, drawn by the noise, terrified of what they might witness, began to breathe again. A few started clapping, hesitant at first, then louder. Someone whooped. Sarah found herself laughing and crying at the same time, hands pressed to her face, watching the taillights of Travis Cole's trucks disappear around the bend. But Dan Whitmore didn't look relieved. He watched the empty road for a long moment. After the trucks had gone, something unreadable, moving behind his eyes, and Preacher standing beside him noticed. He'll be back, Preacher said quietly, just for Dan to hear. I know, Dan said. Worse than before. I know that too. But that night, Dan's small house on Cedar Ridge, which had held nothing but silence for 11 years, was suddenly full of noise, motorcycles lining the gravel driveway and spilling out along the road. A dozen tents pitched in the side yard, the smell of a campfire and grilled meat drifting through open windows. Laughter rolling out into the mountain darkness for the first time in longer than Dan cared to count. Sarah stayed later than she meant to. She sat on the porch steps beside Dan, a beer in her hand that she'd barely touched, watching Preacher and Tiny's and a dozen other members of the club move through the yard like they owned it, because in a way, Dan realized watching them, they did. This had always been theirs too. He'd just forgotten it for a while. So, Sarah said finally, are you going to tell me the whole story, or am I supposed to keep guessing? Dan was quiet for a long moment, turning his beer bottle slowly in his hands. I joined the club when I was 26, he said finally. Right after I got out of the Army. I did 2 tours before that, combat medic mostly though. I ended up doing things a medic isn't supposed to do more than once. He paused. When I came home, I didn't know how to be a person anymore. Didn't know how to sit in a room without checking the exits. Didn't know how to sleep without waking up swinging. Dan. Preacher found me, Dan continued. I was working a gas station outside Billings, barely holding it together, and he came through one day on a run, and we got to talking, and somehow he saw something in me worth pulling back from the edge. Told me the club wasn't what people thought it was. Told me it was a family for men like me who didn't have anywhere else to put the weight we were carrying. Sarah listened silent, letting him talk. So I joined. And for almost 30 years, that club was everything to me. Brotherhood, purpose, people who understood exactly what it cost to carry what I was carrying because they were carrying versions of it too. Dan's voice grew quieter. We did good, Sarah. People think of clubs like ours, and they think of trouble, and sure, some clubs earn that reputation fair and square. But we ran toy drives every Christmas for foster kids nobody else remembered. We escorted funeral processions for veterans whose own families wouldn't show up. We found runaways and got them home safe more times than the state police ever did. So what happened? Sarah asked gently. Why did you leave? Dan's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Sarah thought maybe she'd pushed too far, asked for something he wasn't ready to give. Then he spoke. There was a man in our chapter named Hollis, Dan said quietly. My best friend, closer than a brother. Honestly, we came up together, joined together, rode together for almost 20 years. And 11 years ago, we got caught up in something that went bad. Real bad. A dispute with another club that turned violent over territory that neither side actually needed over pride more than anything else. Dan's hands had gone still around the bottle. Hollis died protecting me. Took a bullet that had my name on it. I held him while he bled out on a highway shoulder in the middle of nowhere, and there wasn't a single thing I could do to save him, despite every hour of medic training I'd ever had. Sarah's hand came up to cover her mouth. After that, Dan continued, voice rough now, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't put on the vest. Couldn't look at Preacher, at Tiny, at any of them without seeing Hollis's face. So I left. Told them I needed time. Drove until I found a town small enough and quiet enough that nobody would ever ask me who I used to be, and I built a life here where the only thing that mattered was whether an engine ran clean. Dan, Sarah said softly, I'm so sorry. I thought I could just be Dan the mechanic forever, he said. Thought if I was quiet enough, gentle enough, I could bury the rest of it so deep it would never surface again. He looked out at the yard at the men laughing around the fire, at a life he'd walked away from, and that had come roaring back the moment he needed it. But I guess some things don't stay buried. Not when the people you love are in danger. Sarah reached over and took his hand, and Dan led her, the two of them, sitting in silence for a long moment while the fire crackled and the mountain night settled around them. For what it's worth, she said finally, I'm glad you called them. Dan managed a small smile. Me too. Took me 11 years to admit I still needed them. Guess it just took the right kind of trouble. So, Travis Cole did sleep that night. He sat in the back office of the abandoned warehouse his crew used as a base on the edge of town, pacing a bottle of whiskey. Half empty, on the desk in front of him, his phone pressed to his ear. I need to talk to him, Travis said, voice tight with barely contained panic. Tonight. It's important. It's 2 a.m, the voice on the other end said, flat and unimpressed. I don't care what time it is. Tell him it's about the Whitmore situation. Tell him it just got a lot bigger than we thought. There was a pause, muffled voices, and then a new voice came on the line. Older, smoother, carrying the particular calm of a man who had never once in his life had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Travis, the voice said, this better be good. Mr. Kessler, Travis said, and something in his tone shifted immediately, deference replacing panic. We've got a problem. The old man at the repair shop, the one we've been leaning on. The mechanic, yes. What about him? Yeah. He's not just some mechanic. He called in the Hells Angels. Not like a couple guys, I'm talking 40, 50 bikes showed up tonight. Full chapter. And their president called him family. Said Whitmore was the reason half of them were still alive. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Say that again, Kessler said, quieter now, something different in his voice. The old man, Daniel Whitmore, he's Hell's Angels, deep in it. And whoever he is to them, it's enough that their national road captain drove out here personally to back him up. Another silence longer this time. Daniel Whitmore, Kessler repeated slowly, like he was turning the name over, searching some internal filing system. Give me a description. Travis did everything he could remember, the gray hair, the calm eyes, the tattoo on his forearm that Travis had glimpsed once when Dan rolled up his sleeve. When he finished, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Travis thought the call had dropped. Mr. Kessler, I need to make some calls, Kessler said finally, and there was something in his voice now that Travis had never heard before in the 3 years he'd worked for the man, something that sounded almost like caution. Don't do anything else with that shop until you hear back from me. You understand nothing. Mr. Kessler, with respect, if we back down now, the whole town's gonna... I said nothing. Kessler snapped sharp enough that Travis flinched. If this is who I think it is, you have no idea what you almost started. Sit tight, I'll call you back. The line went dead. Travis stood in the dark warehouse office phone, still pressed to his ear, staring at nothing, a cold feeling spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. For the first time since he'd arrived in Red Hollow 3 months ago, Travis Cole was afraid. The next morning, Kessler sat in his office on the top floor of the county administration building because Roland Kessler wasn't just some shadowy crime figure operating out of a warehouse. Roland Kessler was the deputy county commissioner, a man who had spent 15 years building a respectable public face while quietly running protection rackets, skimming construction contracts, and funneling drug money through 3 different shell businesses across 4 counties. Travis worked for him. Travis didn't know the full extent of what he worked for, but he worked for him. Kessler picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in almost a decade, a contact from his early years, someone who used to run information for men like him before Kessler had climbed high enough to stop needing that kind of help. I need everything you can find on a man named Daniel Whitmore, Kessler said when the call connected. 68 years old, veteran, runs an auto shop in Red Hollow, former Hells Angels possibly still connected. He paused, and I need it fast. By that evening, the file was on his desk. Kessler read through it slowly twice, and by the second pass, the color had drained from his face. Daniel Whitmore wasn't just a rank-and-file member. Daniel Whitmore had been present 22 years earlier when a federal investigation into organized crime connections across 4 states had collapsed after key witnesses mysteriously recanted witnesses that court records suggested Whitmore had personally quietly convinced to change their testimony, not through threats, but through a reputation so respected among certain circles that his word alone had carried more weight than a subpoena. Daniel Whitmore had connections, old, deep, still active connections to men who now sat on the boards of legitimate businesses, ran union locals, held positions of quiet influence across 3 states. Men who remembered exactly what Daniel Whitmore had done for them decades ago and exactly what kind of loyalty that demanded in return. Kessler closed the file and sat back in his chair, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He had built a very careful, very profitable operation in this county, one that depended entirely on nobody looking too closely, nobody digging too deep, nobody with the kind of connections that could unravel everything with a single phone call. And his idiot enforcer had just poked that exact bear with a stick, threatening to burn down his shop over a few $100s a month. Kessler picked up his phone again, hands not quite steady, and called Travis. Listen to me very carefully, Kessler said when Travis answered. You are going to leave that man alone. Do you understand me? Whatever grudge you're carrying, whatever pride you think you need to salvage, you let it go. Tonight. Right now. Mr. Kessler, I can't just... You will, Kessler said, voice sharp enough to cut. Because if you don't, and this escalates any further, it's not going to stay a local problem. It's going to bring attention I cannot afford. Attention that could unravel 3 years of very careful, very quiet work. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Travis, sitting in this warehouse office, felt something curdle in his stomach. Not fear of the bikers now, but something worse. The sudden realization that the man he worked for was more frightened than he was, and that terrified him more than 50 motorcycles ever could. Yes, sir, Travis said quietly. Good, stand down. I'll figure out how to handle this from here. The line went dead. Travis sat alone in the dark, staring at the phone, and something ugly began to twist inside him. Not obedience, but resentment, humiliation curdling slowly into something far more dangerous. He had spent 3 months building a reputation in this town. He had made shopkeepers flinch at the sound of his voice. He had made an entire community afraid to say his name above a whisper. And now he was supposed to just walk away tail between his legs, because some old man turned out to have friends in leather jackets. Travis poured himself another glass of whiskey and stared at the wall for a long time. He had no intention of standing down. Not really. He just needed to be smarter about it. Quieter. He needed to find a way to hurt Daniel Whitmore that didn't leave fingerprints anyone could trace back to him, and more importantly, that Kessler would never find out about until it was already done. While Travis stewed in the dark, Red Hollow was waking up to something it hadn't experienced in weeks, a morning without fear. Word had spread overnight through every corner of town, the diner, the hardware store, the little grocery on 5th Street, that the Hells Angels had rolled into Red Hollow to stand behind Dan Whitmore, and that Travis Cole and his crew had turned tail and run. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered near the repair shop, drawn by curiosity, and for many of them a cautious hope they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in weeks. Pete Alvarez, the hardware store owner, arrived first, his right hand still wrapped in a bandage from the broken fingers he'd suffered 3 weeks earlier. He found Dan sitting outside his shop drinking coffee with Preacher and 2 other members of the club, and for a long moment Pete just stood there, working up the courage to speak. "Dan," Pete said finally, voice thick, "I heard what happened last night." "Pete," Dan stood setting his coffee down. "How's the hand?" "Healing. Slow." Pete looked down at the bandage, then back up at Dan, something raw in his expression. "I should have told you about what they did to me. I was too scared they'd come back and finish what they started if I said anything." "You don't owe me an explanation," Dan said gently. "Fear like that doesn't need justifying." Pete's eyes were yet now, and he didn't bother hiding it. "Thank you," he said, "for not backing down, for showing us it was possible to not back down." Preacher, watching this exchange from his seat, smiled quietly to himself. By noon, more townspeople had come by, some just to see the bikers for themselves, curious after years of hearing stories about clubs like this one, but many with quieter purposes. The Nguyen's came still rattled from the destruction of their walk-in freezer and left an hour later after Tiny and 3 other members spent the afternoon in their restaurant's kitchen, using tools from the back of one of their support trucks to help repair the damaged compressor unit at no charge. "We don't got money to pay you," Mrs. Nguyen said, watching Tiny work, disbelief written across her face. "Didn't ask for any," Tiny said with awe, looking up. "Dan's family. That makes you family too far, as I'm concerned." By late afternoon, something had shifted in Red Hollow that nobody could quite put into words. A town that had spent 3 months curling inward in fear was slowly, cautiously beginning to unclench. Sarah brought Emma by after school let out, and the 6-year-old, initially wide-eyed and hesitant around so many large tattooed leather-clad strangers, found herself within 20 minutes sitting on Tiny's enormous shoulders, shrieking with delighted laughter as he walked slow circles around the gravel lot, pretending to be a dinosaur while a half-dozen other bikers looked on grinning. "Grandpa Dan," Emma called out, using the nickname she'd given him months earlier, without anyone quite remembering how it started. "Look how tall I am." Dan, watching from beside his workbench, felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 11 years. Preacher walked over and stood beside him, following his gaze toward the little girl perched high on Tiny's shoulders. "You built something good here, Danny," he said quietly. "Different from what we had, but good." "I didn't think I'd get to have either," Dan admitted. "Maybe you don't have to choose," Preacher said. "Maybe this is what it looks like when both halves of your life finally meet each other." Dan didn't answer, but something in his face suggested the words had landed somewhere deep. That peace lasted exactly 2 days. On the 3rd evening, Sheriff Coleman arrived at the shop just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, his cruiser's tires crunching over gravel with none of the urgency his face suggested. "Dan," he called out, climbing out of his vehicle. "Preacher, got a minute?" "What's wrong?" Dan asked immediately, reading the tension in the sheriff's posture. "Might be nothing," Coleman said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe that himself. "But I got a call an hour ago from one of my deputies doing rounds out on County Road 9. Says he spotted a car parked near the tree line behind your property last night, gone by the time he circled back, but he got a partial plate. Ran it this morning." Preacher asked. "Registered to a shell company," Coleman said. "One that traces back after about 4 layers of digging that took most of my morning to a name I recognized. Roland Kessler." Preacher's expression sharpened. The deputy county commissioner. That's the one. Coleman crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Man's been on my radar for years, but never anything I could prove. Rumors about kickbacks, about certain contracts, always going to certain companies, about a few local operations that seem awfully well protected for how much trouble they cause. Nothing I could ever pin down. You think Kessler's connected to Travis Cole? Dan asked slowly. I think, Coleman said carefully, that a car registered to one of his shell companies was parked behind your property watching your house last night, and I think that's not a coincidence. And I think whatever we're dealing with here just got a lot bigger and a lot more complicated than one punk kid with a chip on his shoulder. The four of them stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the sheriff's words settling over the gravel lot. He's watching us, Dan said quietly, figuring out how to come at this differently. That'd be my guess, Coleman agreed. And if he's got county money and county protection behind him, that changes the math significantly. We're not just talking about a street thug anymore. We might be talking about corruption that goes higher than anyone in this town has ever wanted to look. Preacher's jaw tightened, something hard and immovable settling into his expression. Then we don't leave, he said simply. Not until this is finished, however long that takes. Coleman looked between the two men, and something in his face, the careful, cautious posture of a small-town sheriff who had spent years being the only line of defense against forces too big for his tiny department, shifted into something more resolute. Then I suppose we're working together on this, he said. God help me. That night, after the sheriff left, Dan sat alone on his porch, the same spot where Sarah had listened to his story 2 nights earlier, and Preacher came out to join him, 2 beers in hand. You're worried, Preacher said, handing him one and settling into the chair beside him. Kessler's not some street kid we can scare off with 40 motorcycles, Dan said. If he's got real money, real connections, he's not going to just walk away because we made his enforcer look foolish once. No, Preacher agreed, he's not, which means this isn't over, not close to over. No, Preacher said again, quieter this time. It's just getting started. Dan looked out at the dark tree line beyond his property, thinking about the car that had been parked there the night before, watching his house, watching his life, gathering whatever information Kessler thought he needed. I dragged you all into something bigger than I realized, Dan said finally, guilt threading through his voice. Preacher turned to look at him, something fierce and unwavering in his weathered face. You didn't drag us into anything, Danny. You called, and we came same as we would have 11 years ago, same as we will 11 years from now. That's not a debt. That's just what family does. He took a long pull from his beer. Besides, if this Kessler character thinks a title and a county paycheck makes him untouchable, he's about to learn something about the kind of trouble that doesn't answer to a badge or a bank account. Dan managed a small, tired smile. You always did like a fight you weren't supposed to win. Wasn't supposed to win plenty of them, Preacher said. Won most anyway. They sat together in silence after that, watching the dark tree line, both of them aware, though neither said it aloud, that somewhere out there in the dark, Roland Kessler was already making calls, already building whatever came next, and that whatever quiet, fragile peace Red Hollow had found over the past 2 days was about to be tested in ways none of them could fully anticipate yet. Inside the house, through the screen door, Dan could hear Sarah's laughter mixing with Emma's, as the little girl told some elaborate story to a group of bikers gathered in his living room, and for a moment the sound of it, warm, ordinary, alive, settled something in his chest, even as his mind turned over every dangerous possibility of what was coming next. He had spent 11 years building a quiet life in Red Hollow, convincing himself that peace meant staying small, staying invisible, never letting anyone see the parts of him capable of what Preacher and the others had seen him do decades ago. But watching his brothers fill his house with noise and laughter, watching Sarah and Emma folded seamlessly into the middle of it all, like they'd always belonged there, Dan understood something he hadn't let himself understand in over a decade. He wasn't hiding anymore. He couldn't. Whatever Roland Kessler was building in the shadows of this county, whatever Travis Cole was planning in that dark warehouse across town, they were going to have to come through every single person sitting in that living room to get to him. And for the first time since he'd buried Hollis on that highway's shoulder 11 years ago, Dan Whitmore didn't feel afraid of what that might cost. He felt ready. Roland Kessler didn't sleep well that night either, though, for entirely different reasons than Travis Cole. He sat at his desk long after his wife had gone to bed, the Whitmore file spread open in front of him, under the glow of a single lamp, reading through the same 3 pages again and again like they might reveal something new on the fourth pass that they hadn't on the third. 22 years. 22 years he had spent building this life, the county position, the respectable face, the quiet network of contracts and kickbacks that had made him wealthier than anyone in Red Hollow could imagine. And all of it, every careful year of it, now sat balanced on the fact that some old mechanic he'd never heard of before last week apparently still had the kind of friends who could unravel entire investigations with a single phone call. He closed the file and pressed his palms against his eyes. There were 2 ways forward, and he knew both of them intimately because he had used both before. The first was patience. Quiet, careful, methodical pressure applied through channels nobody could ever trace back to him. Permits, revoked inspections, failed licenses. Questioned the slow bureaucratic strangulation that had worked on a dozen small business owners across the county who'd been foolish enough to think they could operate without paying him his share. The second was Travis Cole, and Travis Cole was a hammer, not a scalpel, and hammers had a way of breaking things you didn't intend to break. Kessler picked up his phone and made a different call, this time not to Travis, but to a woman named Denise Farrow, who held the title of County Code Enforcement Supervisor and who owed Kessler more favors than she could ever hope to repay. "Denise," he said when she answered, groggy, clearly woken from sleep, "I need a favor." "Roland, it's past midnight. I know what time it is. I need you to pull the file on a property out on the Red Hollow Highway. Auto repair shop belongs to a Daniel Whitmore. I want a full inspection scheduled, building code, environmental, whatever you can find. Zoning too, if there is anything at all we can hang on it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Roland, what's this about?" "It's about doing your job," Kessler said sharper than he meant to. He caught himself, softened his tone. "I have my reasons, Denise. I always do. Just get it done. Quietly. I want a citation issued by end of week." He hung up before she could ask anything further. By Monday morning, an inspector Dan had never seen before pulled into the gravel lot in a county vehicle, clipboard in hand, and spent 2 hours walking through every inch of the shop, noting things Dan had never once been cited for in 11 years of operation. A fire extinguisher mounted 4 inches lower than code, allowed a drainage grate that needed recertification, a storage shed 12 feet closer to the property line than current zoning permitted, despite having stood in that exact spot since before the current zoning ordinance had even been written. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, standing beside Dan as the inspector loaded his clipboard back into his car. "You've run this shop for 11 years. Nobody's ever said one word about any of this." "Ma'am, I just go where I'm assigned," the inspector said, not quite meeting her eyes, and drove off without further explanation. Preacher, who had been leaning against the workbench, watching the whole thing unfold, straightened slowly. "That's not a coincidence," he said. "No," Dan agreed. "It's not. Kessler. Has to be." Preacher's jaw tightened. "Man's smarter than Travis, I'll give him that. Instead of coming at you with fists, he's coming at you with paperwork. Harder to fight, harder to see coming." Dan looked down at the citation in his hand. 4 violations, a fine of $800, and a compliance deadline of 30 days, or the shop would face closure pending remediation. 30 days to fix problems that had apparently existed invisible and unenforced for over a decade. "He's trying to squeeze me without ever touching me directly," Dan said slowly, understanding dawning. "If he closes my shop through the county instead of through Travis, there's no crime to point to. No assault, no extortion charge. Just bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does. And if it works on you," Preacher said, "he'll do it to every business in this town that gave you a friendly word this week. Pete, the Nguyen's, anybody he thinks needs reminding who really runs this county." Dan folded the citation and put it in his pocket, something hardening behind his eyes. "Then we need more than motorcycles to fight this." The Nguyen's got their citation 2 days later, a health code violation for their walk-in freezer, the very one Tiny had helped repair the week before, cited now for improper installation, despite passing every inspection for the 6 years the restaurant had operated. Pete's hardware store got theirs the day after that, a fire code violation for aisle width that had apparently gone unnoticed since the store opened 9 years earlier. Word spread through Red Hollow fast, and this time the fear that crept back into people's faces was different from before. Travis Cole's threats had been simple, visible, something you could point to and say, this man is doing this to us. But this citations arriving in mailboxes, inspectors showing up unannounced, fines stacking up with bureaucratic indifference felt slippery, impossible to fight, impossible to even prove was connected to anything at all. We can't sue the county for enforcing code, Pete said, sitting in Dan's shop that evening, with the rest of the small group that had begun gathering there nightly, Sarah Sheriff Coleman, the Nguyen's preacher, and a rotating handful of club members who'd stayed on despite Dan's insistence that they didn't need to keep camping in his yard indefinitely. Even if we know it's Kessler behind it, how do we prove it? He's not signing his name to anything. We don't need to prove intent, Coleman said, turning a cold cup of coffee slowly in his hands. We need to prove pattern. 4 businesses all connected to Dan and all cited within the same 2 weeks, and all for violations that sat unenforced for years until now. That's not a coincidence a judge is going to ignore if we can get it in front of the right judge. And if the judge is one of Kessler's friends too, Sarah asked quietly. The room went silent because nobody had a good answer to that. Preacher leaned forward, elbows on his knees. In my experience, he said slowly, men like Kessler build their whole operation on nobody looking too closely. The moment somebody with real resources starts looking, real lawyers, real reporters, real attention, men like that get nervous fast because their whole business model depends on staying in the shadows. You know somebody like that? Coleman asked. Preacher's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I know a lot of people, Sheriff. Some of them own newspapers. Some of them practice law for a living and owe me favors going back further than you'd believe. Give me a few days. While Preacher made calls that stretched late into the night, Travis Cole sat in his warehouse office, watching all of it unfold from a distance, and hatred built in him like pressure behind a cracked dam wall. Kessler's plan was working slowly, quietly, exactly the way Kessler had promised it would. But Travis hadn't touched a single business himself in over a week, hadn't been allowed anywhere near Dan Whitmore's shop. And every day that passed with him sidelined felt like another brick added to the humiliation he had been carrying. Since that night, the motorcycles rolled into town and made him run. He hadn't run. Not really. He'd made a tactical retreat. That's what he told himself over and over, lying awake at night, replaying the moment Preacher had looked at him with that infuriating, unshakable calm and told him he was already scared. He wasn't scared. He was owed. On a Thursday night with 3 of his men gathered around him in the warehouse, whiskey working its way through all of them, Travis finally said the thing he'd been circling for days. Kessler wanted to play this slow, he said. Fine, let him play it slow with the paperwork. But nobody said I gotta sit here doing nothing while he does it. Boston, the heavyset man, his name was Dez, said carefully, Kessler was pretty clear about. Kessler doesn't know what it's like to have 50 bikers laugh you off a property, Travis snapped. Kessler's sitting in his office with his county paycheck, feeling real safe. I'm the one who has to walk around this town knowing everybody saw me run. So what are you thinking? One of the other men asked a wiry guy named Curtis, who'd been with Travis longest and had the least patience for the crew's recent inactivity. Travis was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly on the desk. The old man's got a soft spot, he said finally. That waitress, the kid. The room went very still. Boss Dez said, voice suddenly careful. I'm not talking about hurting anybody, Travis said quickly, though something in his eyes suggested he hadn't fully ruled it out. I'm talking about sending a bavon, making Whitmore understand that his little bikeyon can't be everywhere at once, that the people he cares about are still reachable no matter how many leather jackets show up in his driveway. That seems like exactly the kind of thing Kessler told you not to do, Curtis said. Kessler doesn't need to know, Travis said, and the smile that spread across his face was thin and ugly. This isn't club business. This is personal. Between me and Whitmore, and nobody's going to trace it back to anything long as we're smart about it. Sarah worked the evening shift at the diner on Friday, same as she had for 6 years. The routine so familiar, she could have done it in her sleep. Refill the coffee, take the order, smile at the regulars, check on Emma's homework during the lulls between tables, while the girl sat in the back booth with her coloring books, same as she'd done 1,000 times before. She didn't notice the truck parked across the street until nearly closing time. It was Curtis sitting behind the wheel watching the diner through the window with the patient stillness of a man who had done this kind of surveillance before. And when Sarah finally locked up at 9:30 and walked Emma out to her car, hand in hand, humming some tune the little girl had stuck in her head from school, she felt it, that prickling awareness at the back of her neck, that something was wrong, the same instinct that had once made her notice the way Dan watched every entrance. She hurried Emma into the car faster than usual. She didn't see the truck pull away from the curb until she was already turning onto the road toward home, and by then it was 3 cars back. Headlights carefully staggered so as not to draw attention, following at a distance that would have looked to any casual observer like nothing at all. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel. "Mommy," Emma's small voice came from the back seat. "You're driving fast." "Just eager to get home, baby," Sarah said, forcing calm into her voice, while her eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, watching the same set of headlights hold steady behind her through 2 turns that had no reason to be followed. She didn't drive home. She drove straight to Dan's house on Cedar Ridge gravel, crunching under her tires as she pulled into the driveway faster than was safe. 3 motorcycles still parked along the fence line where members of the club had stayed on, and by the time she'd thrown the car into park, her hands were shaking hard enough that she fumbled with her seatbelt. Dan was outside before she'd even gotten the door open, some instinct of his own pulling him off the porch at the sound of her tires on gravel. Sarah, his eyes went immediately to her face, reading the fear there before she'd said a single word. "What happened?" "Someone followed us," Sarah said, voice tight, pulling Emma out of the back seat and holding her close. "From the diner. A truck. I don't know. I couldn't see who was driving, but it followed us for almost 10 minutes before I turned this way instead of going home." Dan's face went hard and still in a way Sarah had never seen before. Not the gentle mechanic, not even the calm veteran who'd stood unmoved in front of Travis Cole's threats. Something colder, something that made even Preacher, emerging from the house behind him, go quiet and watchful. "Which way did it go?" Dan asked. "I don't know. I lost sight of it once I turned in here." Preacher was already moving, calling out to 2 members camped near the fence line, and within minutes 3 motorcycles were rolling back down toward the highway to sweep the road, engines low and searching in the darkness. Dan knelt down in front of Emma, who was clutching Sarah's leg, wide-eyed and frightened by the sudden tension in the adults around her. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently, his voice transforming instantly from the hardness of a moment before into something warm and steady. "You're safe. You know that nobody's going to let anything happen to you. Not while Grandpa Dan's around, and definitely not while all my friends are around too." Emma nodded, still clutching Sarah, but some of the tension in her small shoulders eased. Sarah straightened, meeting Dan's eyes over the top of Emma's head, and something passed between them. Fear, yes, but also something that had been building quietly for weeks now, unspoken and undefined. "I think it's them," she said quietly. "Travis's people. I think they're trying to get to me because they can't get to you directly." "I think you're right," Dan said grimly. "Dan, if something happened to Emma because of—" "It won't," Dan said, and there was a certainty in his voice that left no room for argument, though the fear behind his eyes told Sarah that certainty was costing him something. "You and Emma are staying here tonight. Both of you. I don't care what anyone thinks about that. I'm not letting either of you go home to an empty house while somebody's out there watching." Sarah didn't argue. The 3 motorcycles that swept the highway found Curtis's truck parked at a gas station 4 miles outside of town. Empty, engine cold, no sign of the driver either. He'd noticed the tail and abandoned the vehicle, or he'd simply finished whatever surveillance he'd set out to do and moved on before the bikers could catch up. Preacher called Sheriff Coleman immediately, and by midnight, Coleman himself was standing in Dan's driveway running the truck's plate through his radio, his face grim in the porch light. "Registered to a Curtis Halloway," Coleman said, reading off the information as it came back. 29 priors for assault and possession. Known associate of? He paused, glancing up at Dan, Travis Cole. "So it's confirmed," Preacher said. "They came after Sarah and the girl." "It confirms the truck was in the area," Coleman said carefully. "Doesn't prove intent yet, but it's enough for me to bring Cole in for questioning and enough for a judge to start taking a real interest in what's happening in this town." Dan stood on the porch, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching Sarah through the window, where she sat with Emma in the living room reading a story in a voice pitched carefully calm for her daughter's benefit, despite everything she'd just been through. "They went after a child to get to me," Dan said quietly, "to send a message." "That's what it looks like," Preacher said. Then whatever line I was holding on to, whatever part of me still wanted to believe this could end without real consequences for Travis Cole. Dan's voice was low controlled, but something dangerous moved beneath it. That line's gone now. Preacher looked at his old friend for a long moment, seeing something in his face that he recognized from years ago from missions and confrontations that neither of them talked about anymore. "Careful, Danny," he said quietly. "This is exactly the kind of anger that got Hollis killed. Don't let it make your decisions for you." Dan closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, visibly wrestling the anger back down beneath the surface. "You're right," he admitted. "I know you're right, but I'm not letting that man anywhere near Emma again, whatever it takes." "We won't let him," Preacher agreed. "But we do it smart, not angry." Kessler found out about the surveillance attempt the next morning, and his fury when he called Travis was unlike anything the younger man had heard from him before. "I told you not to touch that man," Kessler snarled into the phone. "I told you to sit tight, and instead you send Curtis Halloway to tail a single mother and her 6-year-old daughter. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Mr. Kessler, I was just trying to—" "You were trying to satisfy your ego," Kessler cut him off. "And now there's a truck registered to your associate sitting in a sheriff's impound lot and a judge somewhere in this county who's about to start asking questions I very specifically built this entire operation to avoid. Do you understand what's happening right now? The sheriff has probable cause. He's got a pattern. 4 businesses cited within the same window, all connected to Whitmore. And now a known associate of yours caught tailing a woman connected to him too. That's not a coincidence anymore, Travis. That's a conspiracy, and conspiracies get investigated." Travis, sitting in the warehouse with a hangover pounding behind his eyes, felt the full weight of what he'd done settle over him for the first time. "What do we do?" he asked, voice smaller now. "We do nothing," Kessler said. "You do nothing. You disappear for a while. Understand me? No more visits to that shop. No more surveillance. No more anything until I figure out how to contain the damage you've already caused." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something colder, more calculating. "And Travis, if this comes back to me, if any part of this investigation starts pointing toward my office, I will make sure that every single decision you've made over these past 3 months lands entirely on you. Do you understand I have resources you cannot imagine? I will not go down because you couldn't control your temper." The line went dead. Travis sat alone in the warehouse office, the threat in Kessler's final words settling over him with a clarity that cut through even the hangover he had spent 3 months believing he was building something, believing Kessler's operation had made him powerful and touchable, someone this town would remember and fear. But he wasn't powerful. He was expendable, a tool that had just outlived its usefulness the moment it created a liability. For the first time, Travis Cole understood with genuine and creeping dread exactly how far Roland Kessler would go to protect himself and exactly how little that protection extended to the men who'd done his dirty work. 2 days passed in an uneasy quiet. Sarah and Emma stayed at Dan's house, the little girl slowly adjusting to the strange new normal of a home filled with leather-clad bikers who it turned out were remarkably good at building blanket forts and worse at losing at checkers on purpose, in a way that fooled absolutely no 6-year-old. Preacher's calls had started paying off. A reporter from a regional paper, a woman named Alicia Grant, who'd covered organized crime and municipal corruption for nearly 20 years, reached out to Sheriff Coleman, directly having heard through channels neither Dan nor Coleman fully understood about the pattern of citations hitting Red Hollow businesses. "I've seen this before," Grant told Coleman over the phone, the sheriff putting her on speaker in Dan's living room so the small gathered group could listen. Small county one-man consolidating quiet control over contracts and enforcement using code violations as a pressure tool because it's nearly impossible to prosecute. I did a piece 2 years ago on a commissioner in the next state who ran almost the exact same operation for 6 years before anyone caught him. "Can you help us?" Coleman asked. "I can start digging," Grant said, "but I'll need more than a pattern of citations. I'll need financial records, contract histories, anything connecting Kessler's shell companies to specific decisions he's made in office. That kind of paper trail takes time to build." "How much time?" "Weeks, if I'm lucky. Longer if he's as careful as it sounds like he's been." Dan, listening from across the room, felt a familiar frustration rising, the same helplessness, of watching a threat circle closer while the tools meant to stop it moved too slowly to keep pace. "We don't have weeks," he said loud enough for Grant to hear through the speaker. "Not if he's willing to send someone after a 6-year-old to make a point." There was a pause on the line. "Who is this Daniel Whitmore?" "It's my shop, my family. This whole thing is threatening." Another pause longer this time. "Mr. Whitmore," Grant said slowly, "I actually recognize that name. Not from this, from something else a long time ago. You wouldn't happen to be connected to a Marcus Doyle, would you?" Dan glanced at Preacher, surprised. "He's sitting right here." "Small world," Grant said, and something in her voice had shifted warmer. Now more invested. "Marcus helped me source information for that piece I mentioned 2 years back. Off the record, obviously. I owe him a favor or two." A pause. "Hideba. All right, tell me everything you've got. I'll move faster than weeks if I can." That night, after Grant had hung up with pages of notes and a promise to call back within 48 hours, the group sat together in Dan's living room in a rare moment of quiet. Emma long since asleep in the spare bedroom, the club members who weren't on watch duty scattered around the yard in low conversation. "It's starting to work," Coleman said, allowing himself something close to optimism for the first time in weeks. "If Grant can build a real case, if we can get the citations thrown out and expose the connection to Kessler publicly, we might actually end this without anybody else getting hurt." "Might," Dan repeated quietly. "It's more than we had a week ago," Sarah said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. Dan nodded, but the tightness in his shoulders hadn't fully released, and Preacher, watching his old friend from across the room, recognized the particular stillness of a man who wasn't at peace, no matter how the conversation around him sounded. "You still think this ends quiet?" Preacher asked him later. Once the others had drifted off to sleep, the two of them alone on the porch under a sky thick with stars, neither of them could see back in whatever cities they'd each eventually have to return to. "No," Dan admitted. "I think Kessler's smart enough to try quiet first, but smart men get desperate when quiet stops working. And Travis," Dan shook his head. "Travis already showed us what he's willing to do when he feels cornered. A man like that, humiliated twice now, backed into a corner by his own boss. That's not somebody who goes quietly into a newspaper investigation. That's somebody who does something reckless because he's got nothing left to lose." Preacher was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Then we don't wait for reckless to find us," he said finally. "We stay ready for it. All of us, every hour until this is finished." Dan looked out at the dark yard, at the shapes of motorcycles lined along his fence, at the quiet shadow of a man on watch near the road, and nodded slowly. "All of us," he agreed. 3 nights later, at nearly 2 in the morning, the quiet Dan had been dreading finally broke. It started with a phone call. Pete Alvarez's voice, frantic, barely coherent, screaming down the line that someone had thrown something through his hardware store's front window, that flames were already climbing the shelving, inside that the fire department was 15 minutes out at best from the nearest station. Then almost immediately after a second call, the Nguyens, their restaurant's back door kicked in their walk-in freezer's compressor, the one Tiny had repaired weeks earlier, deliberately sabotaged coolant, hissing out into the night air, thousands of dollars in inventory already beginning to spoil. And as Dan stood in his driveway at 2 in the morning, phone pressed to his ear, listening to Pete's voice crack with panic over the crackle of flames in the background, a third call came through, this one from the man watching the road at the edge of his property, voice tight with alarm. "Dan," the biker said, "we've got a vehicle approaching. Fast. No lights." Dan's blood went cold. Because in that moment, standing in his driveway was Sarah and Emma asleep inside his house, with 2 fires burning across town and a car approaching in the dark with its headlights deliberately cut. Dan Whitmore understood with sudden, sickening clarity exactly what kind of night this was about to become. Travis Cole hadn't backed down. He'd waited, planned. And now, with Kessler's careful strategy of quiet pressure crumbling around him and nothing left to lose, Travis was making his move, not against Dan directly, not against the shop that 50 motorcycles had defended, but against everything and everyone around him, scattering fires across the town, like a man determined to burn down as much as he could before anyone stopped him. "Preacher." Dan's voice cracked out into the dark yard, and within seconds the quiet camp exploded into motion, men rolling out of tents, grabbing jackets, engines coughing to life in rapid succession across the property. "What is it?" Preacher demanded, already moving toward him. "Pete's shop is on fire. The Nguyens restaurant just got hit too. And there's a car coming up the road right now with its lights off. Preacher's face went hard and focused in an instant, decades of instinct snapping into place. Split up, he barked to the men gathering around them. Half of us go to town, help however we can until the fire department arrives. The rest stay here. I'm going to Pete's, Dan said. Dan. Sarah and Emma are inside the house. Dan said, cutting him off, already moving toward his truck. That's the priority. Protect them. I need to help my friend before his shop burns to the ground. Preacher grabbed his arm hard, forcing him to stop for one critical second. Danny, think. If that car coming up the road is headed here, and you leave, you're leaving Sarah and Emma with fewer guns than we need. Dan's jaw clenched, torn between two impossible priorities, and in that frozen moment, the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, closer. No longer a distant hum on the highway, but something turning directly onto the gravel road that led to his property. The man on watch called out again, voice sharp with tension. It's slowing down. It's stopping at the end of the driveway. Every biker in the yard went still, eyes fixed on the dark tree line where the road curved out of sight, engines idling low, waiting. A car door opened, then closed. Footsteps on gravel, slow, deliberate, coming closer through the darkness, and Dan Whitmore standing in his own driveway at 2 a.m. with fires burning across town, and his family asleep behind him, felt every instinct from 30 years of hard-won experience snap into focus at once. Whoever was walking up that road wasn't running from a fight. They were walking toward one. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the driveway, and for a moment, nothing moved. Not the men standing frozen across the yard, not the engines idling low in the dark, not even the wind through the pines. Then a voice called out, shaking hands visibly raised even in the darkness. Don't shoot. It's Curtis. I'm not armed. I swear to God, I'm not armed. Preacher's hand, which had drifted to his hip without Dan even noticing, relaxed slightly. Curtis Holloway, he said low and hard, the one who tailed Sarah and the girl. I know, I'm sorry, I never should have looked. I don't have time to explain that right now. You gotta listen to me. Curtis stumbled forward into the edge of the porch light, and Dan saw immediately that the man was shaking, sweat-soaked, despite the cool night air, eyes wide shooting with a fear that looked nothing like the calculated menace he'd shown weeks earlier. Travis has lost it. He's not right in the head tonight. He's not just torching Pete's place and the restaurant to scare people. He's headed here, right now. And he's got a gun. The words dropped into the yard like a stone into still water. Talk fast, Dan said, closing the distance between them in 3 strides, his voice carrying an edge that made Curtis flinch back a step. Kessler cut him loose, Curtis said, words tumbling out in a rush. Called him an hour ago, told him it was over, told him he was done, that Kessler was going to let the whole thing land on Travis to protect himself. Travis went crazy, started screaming that if he's going down, everybody's going down with him, Kessler you this whole town. He's been drinking since midnight, grabbed a gas can and his pistol, and said he was going to finish what he started at your shop before the sun comes up. Said if the angels want to stop him, they can watch him do it. Dan's blood ran cold. Where is he now? I don't know exactly. I left before he did. I couldn't be part of this anymore. Curtis's voice cracked, real shame breaking through the fear. I got a kid too. Different town, different life. But I got a kid, and when he started talking about coming after you and your people, I couldn't. Preacher was already moving barking orders across the yard with the crisp, practiced authority of a man who had commanded chaos before. Tiny Reyes, you're with me. We're heading to the shop right now. Rest of you stay here, protect the house. Nobody leaves this property until we know it's clear. He turned to Dan. You're staying too. Like hell I am, Dan said. Danny, that's my shop, Marcus, 11 years of my life. And if Travis Cole is standing in front of it with a tin can and a gun, I am not going to sit here in my driveway while other men handle it for me. Dan's voice had dropped into something low and absolutely immovable, the same tone he'd used on Travis Cole the very first day this all started. I appreciate everything you and the club have done. I mean that. But this ends with me standing in front of that shop, not hiding behind it. Preacher studied his old friend for a long moment, something complicated moving across his weathered face, frustration, worry, and underneath it a grudging respect he couldn't quite suppress. Fine, he said finally, but you stay behind me until I say otherwise. That's not a request. Dan nodded once sharp. Sarah appeared in this doorway, then roused by the commotion. Emma's small, sleepy shape visible in the hallway behind her, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. Dan, what's happening? Stay inside, Dan said, softening his voice as he turned to her, though the urgency underneath it never fully disappeared. Stay with Emma. There are men here who'll keep you safe. I have to go. Dan, Sarah's voice broke fear and something deeper flooding her face all at once. He crossed the yard to her in a few quick steps, took her face gently in both hands, and looked at her with a steadiness that seemed to borrow calm from somewhere he'd buried a long time ago. I'll come back, he said. I promise you that. You don't get to promise things like that, Sarah whispered. I just did, Dan said, and then he was moving, climbing onto the back of Preacher's motorcycle as engines roared to life around him, the small convoy tearing out of the driveway and down the dark mountain road toward town, toward the shop, toward whatever version of Travis Cole was waiting for them, with a gas can in one hand and a pistol in the other. Sheriff Ray Coleman was already at Pete's hardware store when the call came through about the second location standing in the middle of chaos as volunteer firefighters fought to contain a blaze that had already consumed most of the front section of the building. Pete himself sitting on the curb across the street in shock, staring at the flames with the hollow expression of a man watching years of his life turn to ash. Sheriff? One of his deputies came running from the cruiser radio in hand. We got another call. Whitmore's shop, unidentified male seen approaching the property with what witnesses describe as a firearm and a gas container. Coleman's stomach dropped. Get every unit we've got out there. Now. We've only got 2 units total tonight, sir, and one's tied up at the restaurant fire. Then get that 1 unit moving and call county for backup. Coleman snapped, already sprinting for his cruiser. And somebody tell the fire department Whitmore's place might need them too before this whole night is over. He peeled out of the hardware store parking lot with his lights flashing siren, cutting through the dark mountain silence, his mind racing through every worst-case scenario a 15-year career had taught him to anticipate. Travis Cole stood in front of Whitmore Auto and Diesel at 2:30 in the morning, a red gas canister at his feet, his pistol tucked into the waistband of his jeans, whiskey still burning in his blood, and something far more dangerous burning underneath it, the specific, reckless despair of a man who had just watched everything he'd built collapse in a single phone call. Kessler had cut him loose. 3 months of work, 3 months of building fear in this town, brick by brick. And the moment things got difficult, the moment the man he answered to needed a scapegoat, Travis Cole had become disposable in under 60 seconds of conversation. He picked up the gown can, hands unsteady, and started toward the shop's front door. You really gonna do this, boss? Dez's voice came from behind him. The heavy-set man who'd stayed loyal, even as Curtis fled, standing near the truck with an expression that suggested he already regretted this decision, but lacked whatever it took to walk away from it. You can leave too, Travis said without turning around. Like Curtis did, like everybody's been doing all night. I'm just saying, boss burning down his shop, that's not gonna undo what Kessler did to us. That's not gonna fix anything. That's just gonna get us both locked up. I don't care anymore, Travis said, and his voice cracked on the words revealing something underneath the bravado that sounded almost like a child throwing a tantrum in a man's body. I don't care about fixing anything. I want him to lose something the way I lost everything. I want that old man to watch his whole life burn down same as I'm watching mine. He unscrewed the cap on the gas can. The sound of engines reached him before he could pour a single drop. Travis froze gas cans still in hand as headlights swept across the gravel lot and 3 motorcycles came tearing around the bend in the highway engines, screaming in the dark, followed almost immediately by a 4th vehicle, Dan's truck driven by one of the club members. Sarah's frantic voice somehow already calling ahead to warn them, despite Dan's insistence she stay behind. Drop it, Travis. Preacher's voice cut through the night as the bike skidded to a stop across the lot, dismounting fast. Several men already moving to flank the property from different angles with the coordinated ease of long practice. Travis's hand tightened around the gas can, panic and rage warring visibly across his face. Stay back, he shouted, stumbling backward toward the shop's front door, his other hand moving toward the pistol at his waistband. Stay back, all of you, or I swear to God I'll burn this whole place down with me still standing in it. Dan climbed off the back of Preacher's bike and started walking forward, slow, deliberate steps across the gravel lot, ignoring Preacher's sharp warning hiss behind him. "Danny, get back." "Travis?" Dan's voice was steady, carrying across the lot with a calm that seemed almost surreal given the gas can, the pistol, the wild look in the younger man's eyes. "Put the can down." "Don't you dare tell me what to do," Travis snarled, backing further toward the shop door, sloshing gasoline across the threshold as his hands shook. "You did this. You and your bike gang, you humiliated me in front of my own crew, and then you sat back and watched Kessler squeeze me until there was nothing left. You want to know what it feels like to lose everything I'm about to show you?" "I already know what it feels like to lose everything," Dan said quietly, still walking forward one slow step at a time, close enough now that Preacher's hand hovered anxiously near his sidearm, ready to move if the situation broke wrong. "I held my best friend while he died on a highway shoulder 11 years ago, bleeding out from a bullet meant for me. I know exactly what losing everything feels like, son. And I'll tell you something, Travis, burning down a building isn't going to make that feeling go away. It's just going to add another thing you can never take back." Something flickered across Travis's face, not quite hesitation, but the first crack in the wild momentum that had carried him this far. "Shut up," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You're what, 30 years old," Dan continued, still closing the distance slow and steady, his hands visible, open, non-threatening. "You've got your whole life still ahead of you. Whatever Kessler did to you tonight, whatever he made you feel, that doesn't have to be the last chapter. But if you pull that trigger, if you light that match, there's no version of tomorrow where you get to walk away from this. You understand that. This is the line, Travis, right here, right now. Whatever you decide in the next 30 seconds decides the rest of your life." Travis's hand, still resting on the gas can's cap, was shaking badly now, and behind the anger in his eyes, something younger and more frightened was starting to surface. The same flicker Dan had seen the very first day, buried under all the bravado and posturing. The fear of a young man who had built an entire identity on being feared and had just discovered how quickly that identity could be discarded by someone more powerful than him. "He was going to let me take the fall," Travis said, voice cracking. 3 months of doing everything he asked, and the second it got hard, he just cut me off, like I was nothing. "Because to him, you are nothing," Dan said. Not unkindly, just honest. "That's what men like Kessler do, Travis. They use people like you as tools, and tools get discarded the moment they're no longer useful. You're not the first person he's done this to, and you won't be the last unless somebody stops him. But that somebody isn't going to be you burning down my shop tonight. That's just going to prove every terrible thing he already thinks about you." The gas can trembled in Travis's grip. Behind him, distant but growing louder, sirens finally began cutting through the night air. Sheriff Coleman's cruiser still minutes out but closing fast. "You hear that?" Dan said quietly. "That's your last chance walking through the door right now, Travis. You put that can down, you put your hands where the sheriff can see them, and maybe there's still a version of your life that isn't completely destroyed by what happens in the next few minutes. But if you're still holding that can, when he pulls up, if you've got that pistol in your hand, that decision gets made for you, and it doesn't end well for anybody." For a long, agonizing moment, Travis Cole stood frozen between two futures. Gas cans shaking in one hand, whiskey and rage and terror, all fighting for control behind his eyes. Then his shoulders sagged. The gas can dropped from his fingers, tipping over gasoline, spreading dark across the gravel in a widening stain, and Travis sank slowly to his knees in the middle of it, the fight draining out of him all at once, replaced by something that looked almost like grief. "I don't know how to stop," he said, voice small now, nothing like the swaggering thug who'd walked into Dan's shop weeks earlier. "I don't know how to be anybody except this." Dan closed the last few feet of distance between them, and to the visible shock of every biker watching, knelt down in front of the young man who had threatened to burn his life to the ground, close enough to speak quietly just for him. "Yeah, you do," Dan said. "Everybody knows how. You just start by putting down what's in your hands and telling the truth about what you did. It's the hardest first step there is, but it's the only one that leads anywhere good." Sheriff Coleman's cruiser skidded into the lot moments later, lights washing blue and red across the scene. Travis Cole kneeling in a puddle of spilled gasoline, hands now empty and raised, Dan. Whitmore crouched in front of him, and 50 feet of gravel lot filled with silent watching, bikers who had come ready for violence, and instead found themselves witnessing something that looked strangely almost like mercy. "Hands where I can see them. Everyone," Coleman shouted, stepping out of the cruiser with his weapon drawn, quickly assessing the scene, the gas can, the dark stain spreading across the gravel. "He's not resisting, Ray," Dan called out, standing slowly, hands raised to show he meant no threat. "He put it down on his own. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." Coleman approached cautiously, radioing for backup even as he moved, and within minutes, Travis Cole was in handcuffs, sitting in the back of the sheriff's cruiser, staring blankly out the window at the shop he'd almost burned to the ground, silent in a way that felt different from the silence of a man biding his time. It felt like the silence of a man who had, for the first time in a long time, run completely out of anger to hide behind. Attempted arson, criminal threatening, and I'm guessing about 6 other charges once we sort through everything from the past 3 months, Coleman said, walking back over to where Dan and Preacher stood in the aftermath. "This should have been enough to shut this whole thing down." "Should have been," Dan said quietly. "But Travis was never the real problem, Ray. He was just the hammer. The man swinging him is still sitting comfortable in his county office, probably already working on his next move." Coleman's jaw tightened. Kessler. The sheriff looked back at Travis sitting in the cruiser, then out at the fire trucks visible in the distance, still fighting the blaze at Pete's hardware store, and something resolute settled into his weathered face. "Then let's finish this the right way," he said. "Tonight was too close. Somebody could have died, you Travis. Hell, my own deputies. I'm done waiting on Alicia Grant's investigation to build slowly. I'm bringing in the county DA myself tonight, and I'm telling him everything we've got, pattern and all. If Kessler's dirty, I want him exposed before anybody else gets hurt trying to protect this town." By morning, Red Hollow looked like a town that had survived a small war. Pete's hardware store stood gutted and blackened along its front, half smoke still curling faintly from the wreckage, even hours after the fire department had finally contained it. The Nguyen's restaurant sat dark and silent, thousands of dollars in spoiled inventory already being hauled out to the dumpster behind the building. Mrs. Nguyen standing in the parking lot with her arms crossed, staring at the damage with an expression too exhausted for tears. But something else had changed too. Something that showed in the way people gathered on Main Street that morning, despite the destruction, despite the smoke still hanging faintly in the air, not scattered in fear the way they had been for months, but together in small clusters, talking, comparing notes, helping each other sweep broken glass and haul away debris. Dan walked through town that morning with Preacher beside him, exhaustion etched deep into both their faces after a night with almost no sleep, and at every stop people came up to him, not with fear anymore, but with something that looked almost like gratitude, mixed with a fierce protective solidarity that hadn't existed in Red Hollow in a very long time. "Heard what you did last night," Old Man Garrity said, gripping Dan's hand hard outside what remained of Pete's shop. "Talk that boy down instead of letting your people put him in the ground. That took more restraint than most men have, especially after what he tried to do." "Wasn't about restraint," Dan said quietly. "Was about not letting one more young man's life get thrown away over this whole mess. Enough people have paid for Kessler's greed already." By mid-afternoon, word had spread that Sheriff Coleman had spent the morning in the county district attorney's office laying out everything. The citations, the pattern, Curtis Halloway's surveillance, Travis's arrest, and according to rumors already circulating through town, a full confession implicating Kessler directly in ordering the pressure campaign against Dan's shop and, by extension, every business connected to him. Alicia Grant arrived in Red Hollow that evening, notebook and recorder in hand, and spent 3 hours in Dan's living room with Sarah Preacher, Sheriff Coleman, and Dan himself building out the full timeline with the kind of meticulous, patient thoroughness that came from 20 years of chasing exactly this kind of story. "This is enough," she said, finally closing her notebook, something like fierce satisfaction in her expression, despite the late hour and the exhaustion evident on everyone's faces. Between Travis's confession, the pattern of citations, the surveillance, and what I've already found digging into Kessler's shell companies over the past week, this is enough to end him. Publicly. Completely. "When does it run?" Coleman asked. "Tomorrow morning," Grant said, "front page, and I've already got 2 other outlets picking up the story once mine breaks this kind of small-town corruption story, especially with an organized crime and veteran angle woven through it. That's the kind of thing that travels fast." Dan sat back in his chair, feeling something loosen in his chest for the first time in what felt like weeks. "So it's over." he said, not quite believing it yet. Almost, Grant said carefully. Travis is in custody, and that gives us the confession we needed. But Kessler's still out there tonight, still a free man, and men like that don't usually go down quietly once they realize the walls are closing in. I'd stay careful a while longer if I were you. Roland Kessler read the confirmation of Travis Cole's arrest at 4 in the morning, a call from a contact inside the sheriff's department who still owed him favors. And by the time the sun rose over Red Hollow, he understood with cold, precise clarity that his entire operation was collapsing. He sat in his home office, the same desk where he'd read Dan Whitmore's file just over a week earlier, and methodically began destroying what he could, shredding documents, deleting files, making calls to associates in 3 different counties, warning them, preparing them, buying himself whatever time he could manage before the story broke, and the walls he'd spent 15 years building came down around him entirely. His wife found him there at 7 in the morning, still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by shredded paper. "Roland, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept." "Business trouble," he said, not looking up. "Nothing you need to worry about." But by 9 that morning, when Alicia Grant's article went live, Deputy Commissioner's Secret Empire, how Roland Kessler used fear, fire, and false citations to control a county. The trouble Roland Kessler had spent all night trying to contain exploded into something far beyond his control. The article was thorough. Grant had done exactly what she'd promised, laid out the shell companies the pattern of retaliatory citations timed precisely to businesses connected to Dan Whitmore. Curtis Halloway's surveillance of Sarah and Emma Travis Cole's arrest and detailed confession, implicating Kessler directly in ordering both the extortion scheme and later the cover-up attempt through selective code enforcement. By noon, 2 other regional outlets had picked up the story exactly as Grant predicted. By early afternoon, a camera crew from the nearest television affiliate had set up outside the county administration building, waiting for any glimpse of Kessler as county officials scrambled to distance themselves from a scandal that had overnight become impossible to ignore. Kessler tried to leave his office through the back entrance at 3 in the afternoon, briefcase, in hand, car keys already out, only to find Sheriff Ray Coleman waiting for him beside his own vehicle, 2 deputies flanking him, an arrest warrant already signed by a judge, who it turned out had been quietly gathering his own concerns about Kessler for over a year, and needed only the smallest push of real evidence to act on them. "Roland Kessler," Coleman said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for extortion, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and about a dozen other charges we're still finalizing. You have the right to remain silent." Kessler's face had gone gray. His composure, the same careful, controlled composure that had built 15 years of quiet criminal enterprise, finally cracking in front of the cameras that had gathered to capture exactly this moment. "This is a mistake," he said, voice tight. "I want my lawyer. You'll get your lawyer," Coleman said, cuffing him with the flat, professional calm of a man who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. "Right after we finish the paperwork on everything you've done to this county." Dan watched the footage that evening on the small television in his living room. Sarah beside him, Emma asleep in his lap after a long day, Preacher and Tiny and several other club members gathered around watching the same broadcast, with expressions ranging from grim satisfaction to quiet disbelief that it had actually finally ended this way. Local officials, including 2 members of the County Planning Commission, have confirmed they are reviewing all recent code enforcement actions connected to Kessler's office. The news anchor reported footage of Kessler being led into a police vehicle playing behind her. Meanwhile, sources close to the investigation say Travis Cole, the man responsible for a string of violent incidents in the small town of Red Hollow over recent months, has agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sarah exhaled slowly, some tension she'd been carrying for weeks finally releasing from her shoulders. "It's really over," she said, like she needed to say it out loud to fully believe it. "The legal part, maybe," Dan said, looking down at Emma's sleeping face, brushing a strand of hair gently away from her forehead. "Rebuilding everything Kessler and Travis broke, that's going to take a lot longer." "We'll help with that," Preacher said from across the room. "Long as it takes." Dan looked up at his old friend at the small gathering of men who had ridden hundreds of miles because one phone call after 11 years of silence had been enough to bring them running without a single moment's hesitation. "You've already given this town more than I ever thought to ask for," Dan said quietly. "We gave a brother what he needed," Preacher corrected gently. "That's not charity, Danny. That's just what family looks like when it's working right." Outside, the mountain evening had settled into a stillness that felt different from the stillness of the past few months. Not the silence of a town holding its breath in fear, but the quiet, exhausted peace of a place that had weathered something terrible, and against every expectation, come out the other side still standing. Dan sat there for a long time after everyone else had gone quiet, Emma still asleep against his chest, Sarah's hand resting gently against his arm, and felt something shift inside him that had been frozen for 11 long years. Not the absence of pain, not the erasure of everything he'd buried after Hollis died on that highway shoulder, but something more like permission. Permission to be both halves of himself at once. The quiet mechanic who fixed engines and helped struggling neighbors. And the man his brothers had never stopped believing in, even after 11 years of silence, even after he'd convinced himself that part of his life was gone forever. He looked around the room, at Preacher, at Tiny, at Sarah, at Emma's small, sleeping face, and understood with a clarity that felt like the first real breath he had taken in over a decade that he hadn't lost anything by calling his brothers home. He'd gotten everything back. The weeks that followed felt to Sarah like watching a town slowly remember how to breathe. Pete Alvarez started rebuilding his hardware store within days, insurance money moving faster than anyone expected. Once word got out that half the damage had been caused by a documented arson tied directly to a public corruption case. And every morning without fail, 2 or 3 members of the club showed up in old work clothes to help him frame the new front section, no charge, no explanation needed beyond what Tiny had said to Mrs. Nguyen weeks earlier. Family helps family. The Nguyen's reopened their restaurant 12 days after the fire, and on opening night half the town showed up, packing every table, and half the sidewalk outside Mrs. Nguyen, crying openly as she hugged customers she'd known for years, and a few bikers she'd known for exactly 1 difficult month. But peace, Dan had learned a long time ago, rarely arrived all at once. It came in pieces, and some of those pieces still had sharp edges. "They're offering him a deal," Sheriff Coleman said, standing in Dan's shop 3 weeks after Kessler's arrest, his hat in his hands, his expression carrying the particular wariness of a man delivering news he already knew wouldn't be welcome. The DA's office. Kessler's lawyers came in yesterday with a proposal. He cooperates fully, gives up names of every official he's paid off across 4 counties, testifies against 2 state contractors who've been skimming public works money for years. And in exchange, he does maybe 6 years instead of 25. Dan set down the wrench in his hand slowly. 6 years. "I know how that sounds," Coleman said. "But Dan, if he's telling the truth about the scope of this, if this really does reach into 4 counties, that's not just closing the book on what happened here. That's taking down a whole network. People who've been getting away with this for years, hurting a lot more folks than just Red Hollow." "And Travis?" Dan asked. "What happens to him in all this?" Coleman's expression shifted, something more complicated crossing his face. "That's the other thing I came to tell you." His lawyer reached out to the DA separately. "Travis wants to plead guilty. No deal, no negotiation, just guilty, full responsibility, whatever sentence comes with it. Says he doesn't want to hide behind Kessler's cooperation deal." Preacher, who'd been leaning against the workbench listening, straightened slightly. "That's not what I expected to hear." "Wasn't what I expected either," Coleman admitted. "Kid's been different since that night. Quiet. His lawyer says he's asked more than once if there's any way to apologize to the people he hurt. Real apology, not the kind lawyers usually recommend." Dan was quiet for a long moment, remembering the sound of Travis's voice cracking as he knelt in the spilled gasoline, the small broken confession that had come out of him in that final moment before the sirens arrived. "I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to be anybody except this." "Let him," Dan said finally. Sarah, who'd come by with lunch and caught the tail end of the conversation, looked at him sharply. "Dan, after everything he did—" "I'm not saying forgive him," Dan said, turning to her, choosing his words with care. "I'm saying let him say what he needs to say. A man doesn't get to skip the hard part just because it's uncomfortable for everybody else to sit through. If he wants to stand up and take responsibility instead of hiding behind somebody else's deal, that's the first honest thing he's done since this whole mess started. Might as well let it count for something." The apology, when it came, happened in a county courtroom on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, and Dan sat in the second row between Sarah and Preacher, watching Travis Cole stand at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting suit that made him look younger than his 30 years, hands trembling slightly as he addressed the judge before sentencing. I know an apology doesn't undo any of it, Travis said, voice unsteady but pushing forward anyway. Pete's fingers, the fire, what I put the Nguyen family through, what I tried to do to a man who never did anything except tell me the truth when I didn't want to hear it. He paused, glancing briefly toward the gallery, toward Dan, before looking back down at the podium. I spent 3 months telling myself I was building something. Power, respect, whatever word made it feel like, less than what it actually was, which was just hurting people who couldn't fight back the way I wanted them to be afraid of me. His voice cracked. Mr. Whitmore had every reason to let his people handle me the way they easily could have that night. Instead, he knelt down in gasoline and talked to me like I was still worth something. I don't know if I believe that yet, but I'm going to spend whatever time I have finding out. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who'd clearly seen thousands of defendants pass through her courtroom, studied Travis for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Cole, cooperation and genuine remorse don't erase the harm you caused, and this sentence will reflect the seriousness of your actions. But the court does take note that you declined a more lenient plea arrangement in favor of full accountability, and that the victim in this case has submitted a statement requesting the court consider your capacity for rehabilitation. She glanced down at a paper in front of her. 8 years with possibility of parole after feedback, contingent on continued participation in both anger management and restorative justice programming. Dan felt Sarah's hand find his in the quiet after the sentence was read, and he squeezed it gently, watching as deputies led Travis Cole out of the courtroom, not the swaggering thug who'd walked into his shop months earlier, but something smaller, more human, carrying the weight of what he'd done in a way that suggested for the first time he actually understood it. You wrote a statement for him, Sarah said quietly as they filed out of the courtroom afterward. You never told me that. Didn't seem important to mention, Dan said. Dan, he tried to burn your shop down. He sent someone to follow me and Emma. I know exactly what he did, Dan said, guiding her gently toward the courthouse doors. But I also know what it looks like when a young man finally understands the weight of his own choices, because I spent a long time carrying that same weight myself after things I did in another life that I'm not proud of. Everybody deserves the chance to become something different than the worst thing they have ever done, even him. Kessler's case moved slower, tangled in months of legal maneuvering that stretched well into the following spring, his cooperation deal eventually resulting in the exposure of a corruption network spanning 4 counties and implicating 11 other officials, 3 contractors and a state auditor who'd been quietly bearing red flags for nearly a decade in exchange for regular payments. Alicia Grant's original story won a regional journalism award. She sent Dan a card thanking him, which he kept slightly embarrassed in the same cigar box where he'd once kept photographs of a life he thought he'd buried forever. Red Hollow, meanwhile, kept doing what small towns do best, which was healing in the particular stubborn way that only comes from a community deciding collectively that it refuses to stay broken. Preacher and most of the club rode out 6 weeks after Travis Cole's arrest. The gravel lot in front of Dan's shop suddenly quiet again in a way that felt strange after weeks of noise and motorcycles and laughter filling every corner of his previously solitary life. You sure you're gonna be all right out here? Preacher asked, standing beside his bike helmet, under one arm studying his old friend with the particular concern of a man who'd once watched this same friend disappear into silence for 11 years and didn't especially want to see it happen again. I'm not disappearing this time, Dan said, understanding exactly what Preacher was really asking. I promise you that. You said that before. I know I did, but I was a different man before Marcus. I was still trying to bury half of myself because I thought that was the only way to survive what happened to Hollis. Dan looked out at the empty highway, at the mountains beyond it, at the shop that had nearly burned to the ground, and instead stood stronger than ever. I'm not trying to bury anything anymore. I called you because I needed you and you came. And now I know something I spent 11 years too afraid to admit, that needing people isn't weakness. It's just what being alive actually costs. Preacher smiled, something warm and proud settling into his weathered face. That's the smartest thing I've heard you say in 30 years, Danny. Don't get used to it. Oh, I won't, but I am going to hold you to something. Preacher swung onto his bike, kick-starting the engine, raising his voice slightly over the sound. Christmas run, every year same as we used to do before everything happened. You're coming this time. No excuses, no disappearing, Act, no 11-year silence. You show up or I ride back out here myself and drag you out by your collar. Dan laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the kind Sarah had rarely heard from him before all of this started. I'll be there. Promise, I promise. The convoy pulled out of the gravel lot that afternoon, engines fading slowly into the distance, and Dan stood watching until the last motorcycle disappeared around the highway bend, feeling something bittersweet settle in his chest. Not grief this time, but something closer to gratitude. The particular ache of watching people you love right away, knowing for certain that they'll come back. Life in Red Hollow slowly found its new rhythm. Sarah and Emma moved in with Dan that autumn, a decision that came not from any single dramatic conversation, but from months of small moments accumulating quietly into something undeniable. Emma's toys gradually colonizing every corner of the house. Sarah's coffee mug appearing permanently beside Dan's on the kitchen counter, until one evening in October, sitting together on the porch watching the sun drop behind the mountains, Dan simply said what they'd both already been thinking for weeks. Move in, he said. Properly, I mean. Not just staying over some nights. All the way in. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, something soft and hopeful breaking across her face. You sure Emma comes with a lot of noise? Crayons on the walls, cartoons at 6 in the morning. I've had enough quiet to last several lifetimes, Dan said. I think I'm ready for the noise. They were married the following June, a small ceremony held in the same gravel lot where Travis Cole had once stood with a gas can and a pistol transformed now, with string lights and folding chairs and half the town in attendance. Pete Alvarez giving a toast that made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure. The new ends providing more food than anyone could possibly eat. Sheriff Coleman, standing near the back in his dress uniform, looking uncharacteristically emotional. And when Preacher rode in that morning with nearly 30 members of the club filling the same lot they'd once filled to defend Dan's life this time, to celebrate the new one he was building, Emma ran straight into Tiny's arms, shrieking with delight, and Dan, standing at the makeshift altar, watching Sarah walk toward him, in a simple white dress, felt something in his chest that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in over a decade. Complete. 2 years passed. Whitmore Auto and Diesel expanded. Dan hired on 2 young mechanics from town, including a nephew of Pete Alvarez's, who'd been struggling to find steady work, and the shop that had once nearly burned to the ground became slowly the busiest garage in the county. People driving from neighboring towns, specifically because of the reputation the whole ordeal had accidentally built around Dan's name. Emma, now 8, had taken to calling him Dad somewhere along the way, the transition happening so naturally that nobody quite remembered the exact moment it started. And Dan had legally adopted her the previous spring, a small courthouse ceremony that left him fighting back tears in front of a judge who'd clearly seen it all before and still seemed moved by this particular case. Kessler, after 2 years of legal proceedings, finally received his sentence, 18 years reduced from what could have been decades more in exchange for testimony that ultimately dismantled a corruption network that had been quietly siphoning public money and terrorizing small businesses across 4 counties for nearly a decade. 11 other officials faced charges. 3 lost their positions entirely. The state auditor who had been covering for the network resigned in disgrace before charges could even be filed. It wasn't perfect justice. Dan had learned a long time ago that perfect justice rarely existed in the real world, only the closest approximation people were willing to fight hard enough to build. But it was enough. It was accountability, finally, for years of quiet exploitation that had gone unchecked because nobody had been brave enough or connected enough or simply stubborn enough to stand up and refuse to be afraid. Travis Cole wrote to Dan twice a year brief letters from prison describing the anger management program, the GED classes he'd started, the restorative justice sessions, where he'd finally formally apologized to Pete Alvarez and the Nguyen family in person, both of whom had accepted cautiously the apology he offered. Dan wrote back every time. He never told Sarah exactly what the letter said, and she never asked, understanding, without needing an explanation, that some kinds of grace were private personal transactions between 2 men who'd once stood on opposite sides of a gas-soaked gravel lot, and somehow against every reasonable expectation found their way to something resembling redemption. On a warm evening in late spring, nearly 3 years after the night Travis Cole had first walked into his shop with 4 men behind him, Dan sat on his porch with Sarah watching Emma chase fireflies across the front yard, the mountains behind them catching the last gold light of the setting sun. "You ever think about it?" Sarah asked quietly, settling into the chair beside him, her hand finding his the way it always did in quiet moments. Now a habit so natural neither of them noticed they were doing it anymore. That night, how different everything could have gone. Dan was quiet for a moment, watching Emma's small silhouette dart between the fireflies, her laughter carrying clear and bright across the yard. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly I think about how close I came to not calling preacher at all. How many years I spent convinced I didn't deserve to ask my brothers for help because I'd left them, because I'd buried that whole part of my life like it was something shameful instead of something that made me who I am." "What changed your mind that night, I mean? What finally made you pick up the phone?" Dan considered the question carefully, the way he considered most things, turning it over before answering. "You did," he said finally. "Watching you worry about me, watching this whole town get squeezed by fear because I was too proud to admit I needed backup. I realized staying silent wasn't protecting anybody. It was just protecting my own pride, and pride's never been worth as much as people think it is." He squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't standing alone. It's admitting he was never meant to." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching Emma's small shape weave through the deepening dusk, watching the mountains fade slowly into darkness, watching a life neither of them could have predicted 3 years earlier settle around them, like something solid and permanent and entirely finally safe. Preacher and the club still rode through Red Hollow every June, same as promised, and the town had long since stopped being afraid of the sound of approaching motorcycles. Instead, when that low rolling thunder began building somewhere down the highway, each summer shop doors opened, children ran to the sidewalks, and Main Street filled with people waving, some of them, the very same people who'd once watched those bikes arrive in fear and had learned in the years since to understand what they actually represented. Not danger, family, loyalty, the particular unshakable promise that when someone you loved called for help, distance and time meant nothing at all against the simple, immovable fact that you would come. Dan still fixed engines every day, still worked with the same rough, careful hands that had once held a dying brother on a highway shoulder and years later held a gas can, steady while talking a desperate young man back from the worst decision of his life. He still sat on his porch most evenings with a cup of coffee, though now Sarah sat beside him and Emma's laughter filled the yard where silence used to live. And sometimes on quiet nights when the mountain air turned cool and the stars came out thick and bright above Red Hollow, Dan would think about that first afternoon. Travis Cole walked into his shop, certain he was looking at an easy target, an old man alone with nobody coming to save him. Travis had been wrong about almost everything that day, but he'd been most wrong about that. Because Daniel Whitmore had never truly been alone, not in the quiet years of hiding, not in the frightening nights of confrontation, not in any single moment of the storm that swept through Red Hollow and left it somehow stronger and more united than it had ever been before. He had simply forgotten for a while the truth his brothers had never once stopped believing. That family isn't defined by how often you speak, or how many years pass in silence, or how far away you run, trying to outrun your own grief. Family is defined by what happens the moment you finally call for help, and the people who show up without hesitation, without question, engines roaring through the dark to stand beside you exactly when you need them most. Red Hollow learned that lesson alongside him. A town that once watched criminals walk its streets unchallenged became a town that understood deep in its bones that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand anyway and trusting that you were never truly standing on it in the first place. Daniel Whitmore proved that an old man fixing engines in a small mountain town could still shake the ground beneath men who mistook kindness for weakness. He proved that the past you buried doesn't disappear. It waits patient and ready for the moment you need it most. And he proved above everything else that no matter how many years pass, no matter how far you run, no matter how much silence settles between you and the people who once called you brother, true family never forgets, never abandons, and never ever stops coming when you finally call them home. Red Hollow stands today exactly as it always has, quiet and unremarkable at first glance, nestled peacefully among the Montana mountains. But everyone who lives there now understands something that no outsider driving through would ever guess. Beneath that quiet, ordinary town beats the heart of something unbreakable, A community that learned in the hardest way possible that dignity and brotherhood will always outlast fear and greed. And somewhere on that same stretch of highway, if you happen to pass through on the right summer evening, you might still hear it, the distant, unmistakable roar of motorcycles rolling home, carrying with them a promise that will never be broken. Hell's Angels never forget their own, and neither does Red Hollow.